let's go see what this looks like in our web application code. I think that'll help us get a better grasp on what's going on here. So we're in the tap.net weather Git repository, and we want to open our web application. Now, the file that we're looking for is program.cs. In previous versions of C#, ASP.NET, there used to be a program.cs and a startup.cs, and they've consolidated that into a single program.cs file. But it's all the same. So as we look at this code, let me zoom in a bit. So on line 14, okay, we're using the environment object, and we're using the get environment variable method, and we're getting the service bindings. Okay, so this is part of the process of creating the secrets with those service claims that we talked about. So what will happen is that workload is going to create a volume and attach it or mount it to our pod. And so when we get that, this is actually just going to return a path to our pod's local system, file system. Okay, and then we're going to use that for these services, our Wavefront and our Redis cache. Okay, so you can see here that I'm creating a path, a directory structure here. I'm using the path that was returned from this service binding root. Okay, so this is going to return the root directory. We're going to do a slash and then append this folder, because that's the name of the claim that we gave it in our script code and what will be set in the workload. And then the host is going to be contained in this host file. So the application will open this file, as you can see here. So it's going to read all text from this path and this file. So this is going to return our Wavefront URL. Same thing with the token, right? So we're just going to append this Wavefront API resource claim to the service bindings root path, and the token that we'll need to authenticate will be contained in this file. Okay, this is a file in that volume. And then same thing for the Redis cache. Okay, so in the case of Redis, we're just going to access the host, port, and the password from 3 different files. Now, I skipped here because this is the other environment variable where we are injecting the weather API URL. Remember, this is going to be the API in our AKS cluster, and so this is just going to be a simple URL. Now, scrolling down here, so we're taking all of these outputs from these function calls, and we're creating a cache config. That's how Redis is configured here. So we create a Redis connection, and we set the cache config to the cache host, port, and the password. And then we get the data, our Redis database. And then we get down to the weather API. Okay, this is very simple here. We're just adding a singleton, and we're setting the URL. So we're just creating a weather API object in our C# code, which has a URL property, and we're setting it to that URL. And then same idea for the Wavefront, right? So this is how you would create a Wavefront. This is the Wavefront SDK for C#. So we're passing in the URL and token, and then we're building this sender object here. And then we're passing that sender object to an instance of this Wavefront direct ingestion client. All right, it's not my intention of getting into all of that, really. One other thing I just want to point out is that we're using dependency injection for all of this. So ASP.NET provides us this builder services, and this is its means of creating objects that we can inject into other objects and so forth. So you should be familiar with dependency injection to understand this code. So we create objects based on these interfaces, and then the object that has a dependency on Weather API has a dependency on Wavefront Direct Ingestion Client, and so on and so forth. iWeather application. This is actually the object that has the dependencies on these others. Let's go over to this weather application object. And that is in the other project here that our web application depends on. So we'll go ahead and open that. And here's the weather application being referred to in that program CS file. So you see here, so we're using an iWeather API and this Wavefront direct ingestion client and adding those to the constructor. And so .NET and so ASP.NET will inject those objects instantiated from our program CS file into our weather application. So now the weather application has everything it needs to make calls out to the weather API and pass the traces and so forth to Tanzu observability. So let's go ahead and wrap up the remaining section of our script file. So after we set the environment variable and the class claim, resource claims, and so forth, we go ahead and create our workload here. All right, so in the previous video, when we created our demo app, we already saw these parameters. These are the parameters that are new here. Okay, so we're telling the workload that our environment variable should be named weather API, and we just saw that in the code, right? So in our program.cs file. So it will get the weather API based on this variable. And then these two are going to be the references that will create the volume attached, I should say mounted to our pod. Okay, and so we'll have access to these values. And remember, those credentials and the connection details will be stored in files on that mount. Okay, so going down here, so we just give that 5 minutes or so to run, and then it's just the same game here. We just list the workloads to make sure everything looks good, and we do a get on that. So I'll go ahead and execute this. Switch to the build cluster. Okay, so we get our workload, Kubernetes resource, and we see in the build section, so we have two environment variables here. We've got our project path. So we have the Git repository set to NYC pivot tap.NET weather. However, that just points to the root of the repository. We have to tell it the subpath here. So you remember under the source folder, we had the different projects. So we're telling this workload to get the web project. And then we're setting this environment variable to the weather API, which is our weather API URL. Okay, let's see what else here. And then the service claims are our Redis cache claim and our Wavefront resource claim. Okay, so it looks like we have a little under 4 minutes. We'll return once this has finished. All right, great. So that has finished up. Let's take a look. And I'm liking what I see so far. Everything looks like it's in a healthy state. When we list out our workloads on our build cluster, in fact, you can see the Tanzu Java web app that is from yesterday, and our newly built tap.NET weather web. Okay, so in the next video, we will go ahead and build our weather API.